The Galactic Council chamber was filled with light and pride when they made the announcement. Golden beams shining down from the ceiling as if the stars themselves were watching. Alien delegates from every corner of the galaxy sat on their high thrones with smug faces, whispering to each other, believing this was a day they would remember as their victory. They thought they were making history. They thought they were finally cutting down the one species that had always made them uneasy. The one species that didn't fit neatly into their carefully built order. The humans, the Terrans, the ones who had built too fast, dreamed too big, and refused to bow. The High Speaker of the Council rose from his tall chair and raised his hand. The crowd silenced. Even the air felt still as he spoke, his voice echoing through the massive hall. Humanity is hereby exiled from the Galactic Council, effective immediately. His words rolled like thunder, and every alien cheered. They believed the humans would break. They believed Earth would fall to its knees. The Terran delegation stood at the center of the chamber. Not a single face moving. Not a single word spoken. Their uniforms were plain black, no badges, no symbols, only the small silver crest of Earth on their collars. Their eyes watched the council not with fear, not with anger, but with something colder, sharper, quieter. They stood like a wall, unbroken and unbent, as the High Speaker continued to list their crimes. Too ambitious, he said. Too independent, he said. Too dangerous, he said. And the hall roared in agreement, as if repeating lies enough times could make them real. But the humans did not speak. They did not argue. They did not even raise their heads. And that silence made some of the younger alien delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats because they could feel it too. Something wasn't right. Something in the way those humans stood still made their skin crawl. When the final vote was cast, the numbers flashed above the hall in bright red letters. Exiled. The word burned like a wound across the screens. One by one alien delegates signed the exile order with their seals, smiling proudly. They believed this would be the end of the human problem. No more debates. No more uncomfortable power growing outside their control. But what none of them saw was the way the Terran ambassador's hand clenched just slightly behind his back. No one noticed the way the eyes of the human delegation hardened like iron. No one heard the quiet breath the ambassador took before lifting his head, slow and calm, to look straight at the High Speaker. The room expected begging. It expected anger. It expected emotion. But it got none of it, just silence. A silence that filled the chamber heavier than any scream could. The High Speaker forced a smile, a politician's smile, too wide, too practiced. You may return to your world, he said, but you will no longer have a place among the stars. His words were meant to be final, to crush whatever hope the humans still held. The ambassador tilted his head slightly, not as a bow but as a gesture of understanding. Then he turned around without a single word. The rest of the Terran delegation followed him in perfect formation, their boots hitting the polished floor, like drums in a slow funeral march, step by step echoing across the chamber. Those echoes followed them like shadows as they walked down the long aisle, every alien eye on them, some laughing quietly, some spitting insults under their breath. But none dared to stop them. None dared to stand in their way. As they passed through the massive archway at the end of the hall, the council erupted into loud cheers, clapping hands, waving banners, congratulating themselves for their great decision. They thought they had won. They thought this was the end, but far above the chamber, on the dark edges of space, Terran ships waited, their engines silent, their crews watching the live broadcast with clenched fists and burning hearts. The order came down from the ambassador himself. 3 simple words. We are done. And just like that, the course of history began to shift, slowly, quietly, like the first gust of wind before a storm. The alien news networks broadcasted the exile across the galaxy, showing images of Terran fleets slowly departing from the core systems, long columns of black ships moving without sirens or noise, their formation tight, disciplined, cold, while the council celebrated, calling it a triumph for galactic unity. Ordinary aliens believed it too. They told themselves the humans would collapse without the council's trade. They would starve without the council's power. They would fade into the dark corners of space and be forgotten, but none of them had ever really looked closely at those ships. None of them had seen the way every human eye on those decks burned with the same silent fire. None of them understood that humanity had never needed the council as much as the council needed humanity. Back on Earth, the exile announcement flashed across every screen. In every city, on every colony, from the snowy cities of Europa to the floating platforms above Venus, people stopped what they were doing and watched in silence. Not because they were defeated, but because they were remembering the wars they had fought alone, the sacrifices they had made, the long road they had walked to reach the stars, and now the galaxy that had used their strength had cast them aside. They watched the High Speaker's smiling face on their screens and did not cry, did not scream, they only stood still, the same way their leaders had stood in the council chamber, with quiet steel in their veins. In military bases deep beneath the oceans of Earth, commanders looked at the screens in silence, their hands resting on terminals that controlled fleets the council had forgotten existed. In shipyards hidden behind dead moons, engineers wiped grease from their hands and smiled bitterly, because they knew what would come next. They had always known. In the cold mining stations far out on the edge of known space, workers looked at each other and nodded, a silent understanding passing between them, because exile didn't mean the end. Exile meant no more chains, no more permission, no more limits. The council believed they had stripped humanity of its power, but they had only freed it from the rules that had held it back. In that moment the humans became something they hadn't been in centuries. A single people united under one purpose. They didn't make speeches, they didn't wave flags, they didn't swear revenge. They simply began to move, not with panic, but with the quiet precision of a blade being sharpened. Out among the stars, the last Terran ship to leave the core worlds turned its lights off as it crossed the border of council space. No music played. No goodbye was said. Only a single message was transmitted. Short, sharp, clear. We remember everything. That message was intercepted by a dozen alien intelligence networks. Analyzed, dismissed, laughed at. But years later, they would remember that sentence like a curse whispered in the dark. The council's chamber, once filled with cheers, grew quiet after the humans left, because somewhere deep inside even the most arrogant delegates felt it. The silence they left behind was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of something waiting, growing, preparing, the silence before the first crack of thunder. And though they tried to ignore it, to tell themselves the humans were finished, a cold wind had already started to blow through the galaxy, carrying with it the promise that one day the exiles would return, not as beggars, but as something far greater, something the council would no longer be able to control. Back on Earth, the exile broadcast kept replaying on every screen like a wound that refused to close. The council's declaration played over the cities like a knife turning in silence. No speeches were made by the Terran government. No comforting words were given, because there was nothing to soften. Everyone already understood what had happened. They had been cast out not for their weakness but for their strength, not for their crimes but for their independence. The aliens feared what humanity might become, and in their fear they believed exile would break them. But the humans didn't break, they hardened. The streets were quiet not because of defeat but because of something far colder. People stood in public squares staring at the screens, eyes calm, jaws tight, hearts burning like quiet fire. They didn't cry, they didn't panic, they didn't riot. They watched the High Speaker's smug smile on the broadcast and memorized it. Every second of it burned into their memory, and slowly, something began to shift across the planet, something no council intelligence could ever measure. The council expected chaos. They expected nations to turn on each other, old rivalries to explode. They expected Earth to fracture under the weight of exile. But instead they saw nothing. No civil wars, no breakdown, no weakness. They didn't understand that this was not the same humanity that once begged for a seat at their table. This was the humanity that had learned in silence, that had grown while pretending to kneel, and now stripped of their place in the council, they were finally free to move without permission. Across every continent old banners came down. Old rivalries went quiet. Governments that had bickered for decades began to speak in low, hard voices. Because exile had done something no council order ever could. It had united them. In the underground command rooms beneath the oceans, admirals watched the live council feed without blinking. Their faces still, their hands resting on tables etched with old star maps that stretched far beyond council borders. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. They had spent decades preparing for the day the council would turn its back. They knew this moment would come. It was written in the way the aliens had spoken to them, the way they looked down on them, the way they slowly tightened the chains with every treaty, and now those chains had been cut. Their exile was supposed to weaken them, but it only removed the mask of cooperation, the mask of submission. Across the colonies the reaction was the same, quiet, steady, dangerous. On Mars the workers shut down the Council trade ports with a single order. On Europa the old shipyards that had been restricted under treaty began to light up like sleeping giants waking from their long rest. In the outer asteroid belts the mining stations stopped sending resources to Council-controlled hubs and started redirecting everything inward toward Earth. The colonies did not riot, they moved like soldiers. Following a plan they had memorized long ago, because exile was never a possibility. It was a certainty. They had always known the galaxy would cast them out one day, and they had prepared for that day with a patience no alien had ever imagined humans capable of. The Council believed that humans were too loud, too emotional, too impulsive. They forgot that behind every burst of anger lay centuries of endurance. They forgot that the same species that once burned their own world rebuilt it stronger. They forgot that silence was the most dangerous weapon humans could wield. The exile was not the end of a chapter. It was the closing of one book and the opening of another, and the galaxy wasn't ready for what was coming. Families in the cities looked up at the night sky, seeing the faint glimmer of Terran fleets leaving Council space. Some clenched their fists. Some whispered to their children that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Soldiers in orbital bases removed the Council insignias from their uniforms without a word. Old generals stood at windows with eyes that had seen too much war and simply nodded to themselves. Engineers in deep space facilities began rerouting power to the black projects. Buried beneath layers of silence, politicians who once begged for Council attention sat in smoke-filled rooms drafting something new, something united, something built not to ask for respect but to command it. Even the poorest corners of Earth felt it, the sense of something shifting in the air. The way a forest grows quiet before a storm, humanity wasn't gathering armies on the surface. It was gathering will. The kind of will that had built empires from ashes before and would do it again. One woman standing at the top of an orbital elevator whispered to the night sky, "They think we're gone." And across the world thousands thought the same thing without saying a word. Meanwhile the Council celebrated far away, their leaders congratulating themselves for removing the problem. They didn't realize that the problem wasn't removed, it was unleashed. The humans were no longer bound by Council laws, no longer held down by trade restrictions, no longer forced to obey rules written to keep them small. And in that moment the galaxy made the biggest mistake in its history. It gave humanity something far more dangerous than power. It gave them purpose. In the hidden shipyards under the dark side of the moon, giant construction platforms that had been inactive for decades hummed to life. Their crews moving like shadows, reactors lighting up the darkness. In deep space far from Council eyes, abandoned outposts opened their doors to black fleets no one outside Earth even knew existed. Scientists emerged from secret bunkers with designs they were never allowed to build. Machines long forbidden by Council treaties began to take shape. Slowly, steadily, silently, and all of it happened without a single alien noticing. Because they had stopped watching, they thought the humans were finished. But they had forgotten the oldest truth of all. When you cast humanity out, they do not vanish, they build. When you turn your back, they rise. When you underestimate them, they burn their limits and forge something greater. The people of Earth did not say a single word in answer to exile. They did not give the Council the pleasure of their pain. They only looked to the stars, the same stars that had once welcomed them and now belonged to others, and in that cold silence a promise formed, not spoken, not written, but carved into the heart of every human being. They would return, not as outcasts, not as supplicants, but as something the galaxy would never be able to ignore again. While the galaxy celebrated its own arrogance, believing it had broken humanity, Earth moved in silence like a great machine waking from deep sleep. Hidden wheels began to turn, gears that had been waiting for decades clicked into motion. The exile was not a surprise to those who had been paying attention. It was a trigger, one that unlocked plans written in blood and steel long ago. When humanity first set foot among the stars, they knew the Council would never accept them as equals. They had always been tolerated, never trusted. Treaties had been written to keep them weak, alliances formed to keep them dependent. And smiling alien diplomats shook their hands while holding knives behind their backs. But humans are builders and they do not forget. In the shadows of their obedience, they had built something the Council could not see. Entire networks of hidden bases buried behind asteroid belts, black shipyards under dead moons, secret research stations orbiting nameless stars, all waiting for the moment when the galaxy would finally push too far. Now that the chains were cut, those shadows came alive. In the dark side of the moon, massive hangar doors opened for the first time in a century. Colossal construction bays once disguised as abandoned orbital junkyards lit up in bright blue as engines roared awake. Skeletons of warships that had been hidden under the guise of freighters were completed by engineers who worked without rest. In the shipyards of Mars, reactors hummed like sleeping beasts breathing again. Dreadnought frames that had been locked by Council treaty were dragged out of hiding, their armored hulls glowing in the forge light. Station crews moved like soldiers on a battlefield, every motion precise, no hesitation, no questions. They had trained for this for years. In hidden stations on the edge of the belt, scientists who had once been forced to sign council agreements forbidding human innovation smiled as they tore those contracts to shreds. Their labs came alive with forbidden technology, faster drives that had been shelved, AI command systems that were too dangerous for humans to build, weapons research classified under alien law but never forgotten. They unleashed decades of ideas and knowledge in one night, and the galaxy didn't even notice, because they weren't looking. They had turned their backs after exile, confident that humanity would wither, blind to the storm growing behind them. In the cold black between stars, Terran fleets reassembled. Old ships once forced to fly under council regulation now flew free, their signatures vanishing from every alien sensor. Command codes changed, transponders went dark, black fleets drifted out of the shadows like silent sharks. Not a single alien intelligence agency caught it because the humans had planned this moment for longer than the council existed. Deep in secure command bunkers beneath the Pacific Ocean, admirals stood around war tables, their faces carved with quiet purpose. No more treaties, one of them said, and no one disagreed. Their voices didn't need to rise because this was not anger anymore. It was cold clarity. Across the colony's messages passed through encrypted networks built decades ago. Sleeper cells of Terran loyalists woke up on far-flung outposts. Merchant captains who had spent years pretending to bow to alien authorities suddenly changed course. Factories once producing council-approved components began building weapons that had been outlawed. Orbital stations that had looked quiet and harmless for years suddenly shut off their communications and activated shields. Thousands of little moves across 100 systems, all happening at once like dominoes falling in perfect sequence. Not chaos but orchestration. Meanwhile, in the council capital, alien diplomats drank and laughed. They believed they had thrown humanity into the void. They didn't understand that they had released a force that had never needed their permission. They had forgotten what humanity was. A race that thrives in fire, grows in silence, and returns like a storm. No banners were raised, no parades were made, no speeches shouted to the stars, because humans understood something the council never did. Real power is not declared. It is built quietly until it cannot be stopped. In the inner systems, children were taught in schools about the exile, not as a tragedy but as a beginning. Old generals stood in training academies watching the new generation of soldiers march in silence. Their discipline forged not by pride but by necessity. Whole industries turned inward, the entire Terran economy shifting overnight from dependency to self-reliance. Alliances once chained by alien signatures were replaced by one united command. For the first time in centuries, humanity didn't argue with itself, didn't fight among its nations. They looked outward together with one purpose. Even the stars seemed to hold their breath as the Terran Shadow Empire grew in the dark. Every colony, every base, every fleet became a piece of a single machine. A machine that had been waiting for one reason to rise, and the council had just given it to them. One ambassador in a black coat stood before the main command window on Earth, watching the map of the galaxy unfold in holograms. Red lines marking council territory, black lines showing Terran expansion routes. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the entire war room. "They think they've erased us," he said, "but they've just cleared the field." His officers didn't cheer. They nodded in silence, because they all knew what that meant. For the council, exile was an end. For humanity, it was a beginning. The greatest mistake the galaxy had ever made was to believe that humans needed permission to rise. They didn't. They only needed time, and now time belonged to them. While the council slept in its pride, the first pieces of an empire were already being built in the cold shadows of the void. The same humans they cast out now moved with the precision of predators, and no one outside their borders had any idea how close the storm really was. Whispers started to spread through the galaxy like cold wind, cutting through the quiet night. Small traders from the outer edges of space began to tell strange stories of black ships that moved without a sound, of colonies that had disappeared from Council registry, of strange beacons lighting up near dead stars no one cared about before. The Council dismissed it as the usual border gossip, but the merchants swore what they saw was real. They spoke of massive fleets hidden in the dark that didn't carry any Council flag and moved like hunters through empty space. They spoke of human voices over encrypted channels using codes no one had heard in 100 years. The Council laughed and said humans were too weak to build anything on their own. They called the rumors wild lies, but even as they laughed they sent their spy drones to investigate, and their drones never came back. In the dark corners of neutral space, captains whispered in hushed voices about a system where human ships gathered in silence, a hidden place beyond the edge of Council influence. Some claimed they saw an entire fleet pass through a nebula in perfect formation, engines cold, signatures masked, as if the ships themselves had learned how to vanish into the void. Some said they saw giant carriers with hulls black as night, bristling with cannons like teeth. Others swore they saw civilian colonies thriving without a single alien supply route, no trade, no help, just humans building in the dark. Those whispers crawled through every starport, every bar, every shadowed hangar. They were not shouted like news, they were whispered like secrets too dangerous to say aloud, because everyone who spoke of it felt something deep inside their bones. Humanity hadn't died, they were growing in the dark like a storm behind a curtain. Inside the Council chambers, the whispers turned into reports, reports turned into concerns, concerns turned into quiet fear. Diplomats, who once laughed at the thought of humans building anything serious, began to ask quiet questions during late-night meetings. How many fleets do they have? How far have they spread? How long have they been preparing? No one had an answer, because for the first time in a century the Council didn't know what humanity was doing. They had thrown them out, but never realized they'd also thrown away their ability to control them. For years humanity had lived under the Council's rules, showing them everything they built, hiding nothing, and the Council had grown lazy, arrogant, blind. Now they saw nothing but shadows and silence. On the outer borders, the first Council patrols vanished without distress signals. Their ships later found adrift with engines dead and power stripped clean. No signs of attack, no casualties, just empty hulls, like someone had taken them apart piece by piece and sent them back as a message. The Council's generals stared at the wreckage in silence, because they knew only one kind of fleet could do this, one that planned every move like a blade sliding between armor without a sound. Intelligence officers tried to trace it, but every path led to dead space and black signals. No trace, no trace, no trace. Meanwhile, small neutral worlds that had been crushed under Council trade taxes began to receive help from unknown sources. Supply ships arriving without banners, dropping crates of food, medicine, fuel, and disappearing into the dark. No questions asked, no names given, but the crates were marked with one simple emblem, the silver crest of Earth. Some world leaders pretended not to see it, but their people saw and remembered, and slowly the outer systems began to whisper a new name: the Terran network, the Ghost Fleet, the exiled empire. Inside Council headquarters, the High Chancellor slammed his fist against the table demanding answers, but his intelligence chiefs could only show him empty maps and faint signals. They had built their entire empire on control, on knowing every movement across the stars, but now they faced something they could not predict, something that moved faster than their politics. Something they had pushed away with arrogance. Humanity had become the ghost in their perfect machine. Invisible, unstoppable, unmeasured. Some smaller Council members began to panic, sending private messages to their own fleets warning them not to engage human ships. Others started to secretly reach out to the Terran network, offering deals in exchange for protection. The same races who once voted to exile humanity now whispered like frightened children, because they understood before anyone else that power had shifted in the dark. The Council had power on paper, but the humans had something stronger. They had nothing left to lose. Out in the void where stars were nothing but cold pinpricks, a fleet of Terran dreadnoughts glided past a dead moon, their hulls black as the void, engines whispering like wind. They did not send warnings, they did not boast, they simply moved, and their movement alone made the galaxy nervous. Their fleet commanders spoke in clipped tones, coordinating like a single machine, because they were not improvising, they were following a plan that had been written decades ago. When the Council still believed they were in control, the exiles had never been broken, they had been waiting. For the first time in its history, the Galactic Council could feel something slipping through its fingers. The illusion of power they had held for generations cracked quietly as they watched shadows gather at the edge of their precious maps. And they realized too late that whispers are the first signs of storms, because when humanity moves, they don't roar at the beginning, they whisper, they build, they prepare, and then they strike. And the galaxy had just begun to hear those whispers in the dark. A century after exile, the silence broke. The storm humanity had built in the shadows finally began to move. For years, the Council had treated the whispers as ghost stories, but now the ghosts had become fleets, Massive black dreadnoughts rose from the edge of dark space like shadows, swallowing the light, their hulls gleaming faintly with cold silver lines. The symbol of Earth burned into the metal itself like a scar on the stars. They didn't announce their arrival, they didn't send diplomats, they simply appeared on Council long-range sensors like a nightmare made real. Warning systems screamed across border worlds as Terran signatures lit up every scanner, and yet not a single human voice spoke. No declarations. No demands, no promises, just quiet, terrifying presence. At first the Council thought it was a trick, a bluff, maybe a show of power meant to intimidate, but when the first wave of Terran fleets crossed the trade lanes with perfect precision, their movements calculated down to the second, the panic began to spread in every star system. The Council had ruled for centuries. Alien commanders, who once laughed at human technology, now stared at sensor feeds showing ships larger than anything they had ever built, dreadnoughts with layered armor, cruisers gliding like knives, fighter swarms in tight formations like blackbirds in a storm, and at the center of every fleet a single massive carrier. A floating city of war, silent, unyielding. Border patrol fleets were ordered to intercept, but they never reached their targets. Their communication lines went dark, their power signatures disappeared as if someone had erased them from the map without firing a single shot. The Council military scrambled in confusion because the humans weren't attacking, they were surrounding, sealing off hyperlanes, cutting through old trade routes like a net tightening around prey. Alien commanders argued, diplomats screamed, but the Terran fleet moved, like it was following a script written long before the Council even realized the play had begun. On neutral worlds, people stepped outside their domes to look at the black silhouettes of Terran warships hanging in orbit, silent and steady. And in their silence, the people understood what the Council refused to believe. The humans were no longer begging for a seat at the table. They had built their own, forged in exile, sharpened in silence, perfected over a century of preparation. Colonies that had once been too afraid to speak began sending signals to the Terran fleet, offering food, supplies, loyalty, some out of fear but many out of something else, respect. Because when the galaxy had cast them out, the humans didn't vanish, they rose. Inside the Council chamber, the High Chancellor stared at the holomap in disbelief. Entire sectors of space blinking red with Terran presence. The fleet movements were clean, disciplined, perfect. Their ships didn't drift, didn't hesitate, didn't waste time. They moved like one single machine powered by quiet fury. The Chancellor demanded reports from every commander, but none of them had real answers. They didn't even know where these fleets were built, how long they'd been hiding, or how many more were still out there. The Council had spent 100 years believing exile would make humanity small, but they had never understood that cutting a wolf loose doesn't make it weaker, it makes it wild. The first Terran transmission arrived 3 days later, a single line broadcast across every Council frequency. We do not seek your approval. That was it. No anthem, no threat, no justification, just cold words that carried more weight than entire fleets of Council ships. The silence after that message was heavier than any explosion, because everyone in that chamber knew they were not dealing with the desperate outcasts they had once humiliated. This was an empire now. An empire built on memory, silence, and steel. Council military leaders suggested preemptive strikes, but none of them moved because deep down they knew they would lose. They had grown soft under the illusion of control. While humanity had been sharpening its claws in the dark, their fleets were scattered, their logistics slow, their pride heavy. The Terran Empire had the one thing they didn't: unity and patience. Across border colonies, alien citizens watched Terran ships pass overhead without firing a single shot. But their presence alone made entire cities tremble. Their formation was too perfect, their silence too loud. The Council issued emergency broadcasts demanding every world stay loyal. But some governors shut down their transmitters, not out of rebellion but because they knew what side would win if the storm truly broke. Traders whispered in the dark markets that the Terran fleet was offering protection without taxes, without Council strings, and those whispers spread faster than Council orders could stop them. For humanity, this was not the start of a war, this was the opening of a door they had built with their own hands. For 100 years they had watched and waited. Now they moved not with rage but with certainty. Their admirals sat in dark command rooms, their eyes locked on holographic maps, watching the Council panic like an old empire rotting from the inside. They still think they can control us? One admiral said softly. Let them think, another replied. We've already taken everything that matters. And they were right, because war wasn't won by noise, it was won by silence, by patience, by striking when the enemy still thought they were safe. The Council had cast humanity out believing they'd removed a threat, but what they really did was give that threat space to grow into something they could no longer contain. And now, as black fleets stretched across the stars like shadows swallowing light, the galaxy understood something too late. Humanity hadn't returned to ask for forgiveness or a place at the table. They had returned to claim what was theirs, and no one could stop them. Inside the council chamber, panic was no longer a whisper. It was a storm. Walls that had once echoed with arrogance now echoed with fear. The same delegates who had voted to cast humanity out now shouted over each other, desperate and trembling. The High Chancellor slammed his hands against the table, but even his voice could no longer control the room. Holographic maps lit up the air in sharp red lines. Every one of those red lines marked the presence of Terran fleets. Whole sectors were already surrounded. Their communications severed, their supply chains snapped like brittle glass. Every attempt to send a fleet to intercept ended in silence. Not because of war, but because the Terrans had already moved faster than the Council's imagination could follow. The galaxy's once proud rulers were realizing they were no longer the ones dictating the game. They were trapped inside it. Military commanders who once mocked the human fleets now stared pale-faced at the tactical projections. Their fleets scattered soft, easy to break. The Terran Empire had built its power in silence, while the Council had grown lazy in its pride. Their defensive plans were old, their reaction times slow, their fleets too spread out. Alien officers stuttered their reports as they admitted their borders were collapsing. Without a single shot fired, the humans hadn't attacked. They had surrounded the Council like a hunter circling wounded prey. And that scared the Council more than open war ever could. Because they knew what came next wasn't negotiation. It was control. Delegates from smaller races began shouting about surrender. Before anything worse could happen, they whispered that maybe the humans would show mercy if they submitted early, but the larger powers screamed back, refusing to accept the truth. They still believed their numbers and treaties could save them. They didn't see that all their power was already meaningless. The High Chancellor turned to his intelligence chief, demanding answers, and got nothing but silence because even their spies had gone dark. Every agent they sent toward Terran space had vanished, their networks cut apart like silk in a storm. They didn't even know where the Terran command center was or how many fleets they actually had. For a council that had always relied on control and knowledge, the darkness itself was a weapon that was slowly strangling them. Outside the chamber in the great city beneath the council spire, civilians were glued to massive screens showing grainy images of the Terran Armada's black ships lined like walls across the stars. The people who had once mocked the humans as weak now spoke their names in fear. Markets crashed, trade routes froze, border worlds began to declare neutrality to avoid being crushed between the storm and the council's fading power. Panic swept through the colonies like wildfire because everyone knew the council had lost control, and when power cracks, it cracks fast. The High Chancellor stared at the giant star map, his face drained of color. The Terran fleets were too perfect, their movements too clean. They didn't stumble, they didn't bluff, they didn't send diplomats to explain or threaten. They just stood there waiting, and that was what terrified the galaxy most. Silence was the Terrans' greatest weapon now. Silence meant power, silence meant confidence, silence meant the decision was already made long before the Council even woke up to the war they had started a century ago. One military leader suggested a preemptive strike, but even he couldn't finish his sentence. The room went cold. Every pair of eyes knew what would happen if they fired first. They had seen the recordings of what little resistance remained on the frontier. Small fleets wiped off the map without warning, their wrecks found floating in the void like a reminder of who held the blade now. No one wanted to say it out loud, but every single leader in that chamber knew. If the humans attacked, the Council would not survive. Smaller races broke away first, their ambassadors sending hidden messages to Terran envoys offering neutrality, offering resources, offering loyalty just to survive. The larger races tried to stop them, but fear is stronger than pride, and soon the unity the Council had bragged about for centuries began to crumble piece by piece. Cracks spreading like lightning through old stone. The same allies who once stood together against humanity now turned against each other, fighting over who could save themselves first, and through it all the humans said nothing. They didn't need to. Their fleets spoke for them. The Chancellor finally lowered his head, his hands shaking, whispering the words he once believed would never leave his mouth. We pushed too far. And in that quiet moment the chamber fell still because they all knew it was true. Their arrogance had built this storm. Their cruelty had forged the weapon now aimed at their throat. For decades they called humans too ambitious, too dangerous, too proud. And now they were right, but it was too late to stop it. Outside on 100 border worlds, Terran fleets moved in closer, their formations flawless like a single organism made of steel. Alien fleets pulled back in panic, trade hubs went silent. The galaxy held its breath as the Council scrambled like cornered prey. For a century they had ruled through fear and control. Now they were the ones who were afraid. Now they were the ones who were trapped, and humanity hadn't even needed to fire a single shot. The power they had lost wasn't taken by force, it was stripped away by their own mistake. They had cast humanity out thinking they were safe. but the wolves they pushed out into the cold had returned. And this time the humans owned the night. By the time the council finally admitted what they had done, the stars above their capital burned with the cold light of Terran warships. Thousands of black hulls floated in perfect silence, forming a ring around the system like a noose around a trembling throat. The fleets didn't shout or broadcast demands. They simply existed like a wall that no one could break. Their formation too precise, their power too absolute. Every station and every sensor in the system picked up their presence, and every reading said the same thing: the Terran Empire had arrived, not as beggars, not as rebels, but as rulers. Inside the council chamber, the High Chancellor stood frozen, staring at the massive hollow screen where the Terran fleet filled the sky. His voice cracked when he whispered what everyone already knew. "It's too late." All around him, delegates who once shouted for humanity's exile now trembled in their seats, their voices reduced to broken whispers, asking questions that had no answers. They asked how many ships there were, but the sensors couldn't count them fast enough. They asked what the humans wanted, but the humans hadn't said a word. They asked what to do, but no one dared to speak because every single soul in that room could feel it in their bones. The balance of power that had existed for centuries had shattered, and there was no way to glue it back together. Ambassadors who had laughed in humanity's face now begged to open a channel, their hands shaking as if they could talk their way out of a storm. But the Terran fleet remained silent, their silence louder than any threat, louder than any cannon, louder than war. The council military sat in their corner with dead eyes. Their fleets were useless now, scattered, weak, soft from years of arrogance. They had nothing that could stand against the machine floating above their heads. The Terran Empire had spent a century building what the Council believed was impossible and unstoppable. United fleet forged in exile, sharpened in the dark, and now that it stood before them, the Council could do nothing but watch the end of its own age unfold. Entire planets under Council rule began transmitting pleas for protection directly to the Terran fleet, bypassing their own leaders' colonies, who once feared humanity now sought their shadow because they knew the Council could not protect them anymore. A single Terran ship broke formation and entered orbit over the Council capital world. Its hull black, its engines silent. It didn't need escorts because one ship was enough to silence an entire world. The Council watched the screen as the ship hovered like a predator watching prey. Their planetary defense grids didn't fire because no one dared to issue the order. They knew what would happen if they tried. It wasn't a battle, it was execution. Every defense commander sat frozen in his chair, staring at the Terran insignia glowing faintly on the dreadnought's hull. The same insignia they had mocked a century ago when they cast humanity out. Then the transmission came, not with fanfare, not with ceremony, but with a calm, steady human voice. "We gave you peace," it said. "You gave us chains, now you will remember silence." And then the line went dead. No more words, no conditions, no negotiations, just a message that sent a cold wave through every alien heart in the galaxy. The Chancellor fell back into his chair, his hands shaking, because there was no counter-argument, no political trick, no army behind him. The galaxy had changed. Hands without a single shot fired. In the outer sectors, Council worlds began defecting one after another, not because of war, but because they knew where power now lived. Governors tore down Council banners and raised blank signals. Fleets turned around. Trade stations opened their gates to Terran envoys. It was not conquest, it was collapse. The Council had built its rule on fear, but humanity ruled with silence and presence. And silence was far more terrifying because it left no room for hope, only certainty. The High Chancellor tried to give a speech, tried to remind the galaxy of the Council's strength, but no one listened. His voice broadcast into the void like a ghost of a dead empire. No one cared about their treaties anymore. No one respected their authority. Their empire had ended the moment the Terrans arrived, not with fire, but with the crushing weight of everything the Council had done to them. Every betrayal, every insult, every humiliation now stood above them in the form of black warships cutting through the stars. Down on the capital streets, crowds gathered, staring at the sky as the Terran dreadnought blocked out the sun, its shadow swallowing the entire skyline. No bombs fell, no troops landed, no violence came, only silence, the silence of something that no longer needed to prove its power, because its power was absolute. A young alien child looked up at the ship and asked his father what it meant. The father had no answer, because how do you explain to a child that the empire you live under is already dead? One by one, Council leaders signed their own surrender orders, not to save their power but to save themselves. The same pen they once used to exile humanity now scratched their names on papers that begged for mercy. And for the first time in galactic history, it wasn't the Council deciding the fate of others. It was the humans deciding the fate of the Council. The Terran fleet didn't need to demand anything. The galaxy offered itself out of fear and respect. And deep inside every alien heart won. Truth burned. They had created this themselves. They had forged this storm the day they cast humanity out. When the final broadcast echoed across the galaxy, the Chancellor's voice was barely more than a whisper. "We thought exile would end them," he said. "But exile built them." And across the stars billions of beings listened as the new era began, without applause, without cheers, without fanfare. Only the cold certainty of power shifting hands. The humans didn't ask to rule. They didn't have to. They simply rose from the shadows, and the galaxy fell into their silence.